The October sky above the village of Malinovka was gray, like hardened ash. The leaves had long since fallen. The kitchen gardens had turned black, and the first frost had already silvered the tilting fences. People hurried about their business, pulling their jackets tight and not looking around. Nobody paid much attention to the girl walking along the roadside with a heavy backpack on her shoulders. A small figure, drooping shoulders, eyes fixed somewhere ahead, where the hills gave way to wasteland, and the wasteland ended in a dark line of forest. Nobody knew that this girl would change the life of the entire village within a few months. Her name was Anya. She was 16 years old, and she had nothing except an old backpack, a few tools, and knowledge that nobody around her took seriously. Behind her lay a home from which she had been driven out. Not a stranger's home, her own. Her stepfather had placed her bag by the threshold the evening before. Her mother stood in the doorway, not raising her eyes, and said nothing. Anya didn't shout or plead. She simply picked up the backpack, added the few things she considered important: an old notebook covered in diagrams and notes, a handful of seeds and small paper packets, a coil of wire, and a small spade, and left. She walked until the village was behind her. Then she stopped and looked at the hill. The hill was ugly, bare, with protruding layers of clay and stiff yellowed grass. Nobody wanted this plot. It lay at the very edge of the village, far from the houses, and was considered unfit for farming. Too stony, too steep, too awkward. But Anya looked at it differently from everyone else. She looked at it and saw possibility. Anya took out her notebook. She leafed through pages covered in formulas, drawings, tables, found the section she needed, read several lines, raised her eyes to the hill, and slowly nodded. She knew what she would do. She would start digging. People who happened to notice her in the first days couldn't understand what was happening. On the outskirts of the village, at the foot of the ugly hill, a girl with a spade had appeared. She dug in the morning. She dug during the day. She dug until dusk, when her hands could no longer obey her and her back burned like fire. Then she settled right there at the hill under a piece of tarpaulin and an old jacket, and at dawn she appeared again. The village gradually began to take notice. At first people simply watched. Then they started coming closer. Then they began whispering among themselves. Rumors spread quickly. In a small village they always do. By the end of the first week, almost everyone in Malinovka knew about the strange girl who had set up camp on the wasteland and was digging up the earth for no apparent reason. Some called her the mole. Some said she was clearly not right in the head. A neighbor from the far end of the street, Uncle Semyon, a heavy-set man with a loud voice and a habit of voicing opinions on everything, walked past one morning, looked at the pit Anya had already managed to dig, shook his head, and said loudly enough for her to hear that the girl had completely lost it and was digging like a mole, and that come spring it would all flood anyway. Anya lifted her head, looked at him calmly, and lowered the spade back into the earth. She didn't answer. She dug, but inside, where nobody could see, she was clenching her teeth and thinking that she would prove everything to all of them. Not with words, with deeds. Anya had not grown up in the kind of family where books were read or ideas were discussed. Her mother worked on a farm, her stepfather wherever he could find work. There were almost no books in the house. But when Anya was 12, she found on the attic an old stack of agricultural journals, yellowed, with pages stuck together, dating back to Soviet times. She read every one of them. Then she asked her biology teacher to explain the words she didn't understand. Then she started going to the district library and borrowing everything she could find on soil, plants, heat exchange, and agronomy. The biology teacher, Nina Petrovna, an elderly woman with thick lensed glasses, looked at her with surprise and something resembling admiration. It was she who gave Anya a notebook and told her that knowledge was the only thing that could never be taken away. It was she who explained the principle of geothermal heat, the fact that Earth at a depth of more than a meter holds above zero temperatures even in the harshest frosts. It was she who once showed her an article about underground greenhouses that had been used since ancient times and were beginning to be applied again in cold regions. Anya read the article 3 times. Then she closed her eyes and saw it all so clearly, as though she had already been there, in a warm underground space where tomatoes and herbs grew even in winter. From that moment, she knew that one day she would build something like it. She simply hadn't thought it would happen like this. At 16, on a wasteland at the foot of someone else's hill, with no money, and no one's help. But sometimes circumstances decide for a person. The first 2 weeks were the hardest. Not physically, though the earth at the foot of the hill turned out to be tough, stony, threaded with the roots of old bushes that didn't want to give way, but inwardly. Anya was alone, completely alone. She woke under the tarpaulin at dawn, when the grass was covered in frost, and lay motionless for the first minutes, staring up at the gray sky. Then she got up. She lit a small fire from dry branches, warmed her hands over the flame, ate whatever little she had managed to find. Sometimes potatoes from an abandoned vegetable patch, sometimes bread given to her by an elderly woman she didn't know who stood outside the shop. Then she picked up her spade and went to dig. She was digging the pit according to a precise plan from her notebook. Not just a hole, but a rectangular excavation with exact dimensions, 8 meters long, 3 meters wide, nearly 2 meters deep. One end of the pit ran into the slope of the hill. This gave additional protection from wind and cold. The other end faced south, toward the side where sunlight lingered longest. Each day she dug approximately half a meter deeper. The earth gave way with difficulty. When the spade struck a stone, she had to work around it or pull it out by hand. Her hands became covered in calluses. Her fingernails broke off. Once the spade slipped and struck her leg, not hard, but painfully, and for several days Anya walked with a limp. She bandaged the leg with a strip of cloth torn from an old shirt and kept working. Nobody offered to help. Almost nobody, that is. On the 8th day, a boy of about 10 approached the pit, tousled, in a jacket much too large for him, with curious dark eyes. He stood at the edge and looked down to where Anya was throwing spadefuls of earth onto the mound. He stood there. He watched. And the next day he came back, with a small child's spade in his hand. His name was Mitya. Anya looked at the spade, then at him. She smiled, for the first time in many days. He helped her for 2 hours. It was little, but it was something more than physical help. It was the first kind gesture in Malinovka directed her way, and it changed something inside her. It became just a little easier to breathe. By the end of the 3rd week, the pit was ready. Anya stood at the edge and looked down, at the rectangular hollow in the earth, neat, with even walls, with drainage channels in the corners that she had dug specially so it wouldn't flood in spring. The first major stage of the work was done, but there was still more ahead. The next stage, the walls. Anya knew that bare earth would eventually begin to crumble. The walls needed to be reinforced, and she chose the most accessible material, clay. There was an abundance of it right here, in the hillside. Anya mixed the clay with straw, dry straw she found at the edge of an abandoned field, and applied the mixture to the walls in even layers, smoothing it with her palms. A mixture of clay and straw is one of the oldest building materials in the world. Durable, warm, barely letting through the cold. Anya had read about this. Now she was doing it with her own hands. The layers were applied slowly. Each one had to dry before the next. This took days. While the walls dried, Anya turned to the next problem, the roof. The roof of an underground greenhouse had to let in light. Without it, plants would not grow. She needed window frames or something like glass. She had no money at all, so she would have to search. She walked through the village. She went into backyards, asked the owners whether they had anything spare. In most cases, people simply waved her away. Once, an irritable woman chased her out of the yard. Anya left without a word. But one day she knocked at the gate of a lopsided house on the edge of the village. An old man named Vasily Ivanovich lived there, solitary, reserved, with a reputation as someone who didn't let strangers in. Anya knocked anyway. She explained what she wanted. She showed him the drawing from her notebook. The old man looked at the drawing for a long time, then at her. Then he offered to step into the shed. In the shed, behind piles of old things, Anya saw several window frames. Old, peeling, but intact. The glass in them was somewhat cloudy, but not cracked. She looked at them as though she had found gold. The old man helped her carry the frames to the pit, silently, without unnecessary words. On his way out, he paused for a moment and looked at the hole with its clay walls. He said quietly that it was cleverly thought out, and there was no mockery in his voice. He was the first adult in the village to say something like this to her. Anya laid the frames horizontally above the pit, creating a sloping, transparent roof facing south, toward where, on short winter days, at least some sunlight arrived. The gaps between the frames she filled with strips of old rubber found by the roadside. The frames rested on wooden beams that Anya had pulled from a collapsed shed on the wasteland. Having asked the owner's permission, he had shrugged and said he didn't care. She now had a space, enclosed, sheltered from wind and snow, with a transparent ceiling for light. But it wasn't enough. Ventilation was needed. Otherwise, moisture would accumulate inside, and mold would kill the plants faster than the frost. Anya pierced two small openings in the end wall of the pit, one near the floor, another near the ceiling. Through the lower one, cold air came in. Through the upper one, warm air escaped. A primitive draft that worked by itself, without any mechanics. She covered the openings with pieces of sacking, so it wouldn't blow through too strongly, but air would still circulate. Inside the greenhouse, it grew warmer with each day. The earth at 2 meters depth held a temperature of about 8 to 10 degrees above zero. The glass roof retained the heat of the sun's rays. The clay walls kept the outside cold from entering. One morning, Anya stood inside her greenhouse and felt her cheeks warming. Outside, it was already -15. Here, +8. She closed her eyes for a moment. It was working. Everything she had read, everything she had drawn in her notebook, everything she had believed, it was all true. She opened her eyes and took the small paper seed packets from her pocket. It was time to plant. Anya made the beds directly in the earthen floor of the greenhouse, loosening the soil, mixing it with compost found at the edge of a field, making even furrows. The seeds were simple and unpretentious: spring onion, dill, parsley, lettuce. A few potato tubers set aside in advance. Carrot seeds in a separate packet she had guarded most carefully. Some radish seeds. They germinated fastest of all, and Anya knew that the first radish harvest would give her confidence sooner than anything else. She planted all of it carefully, patiently, as though placing something fragile and precious. In a sense, she was. These were not just seeds. They were her stake. Everything she had. By November, when the snow had settled firmly over the fields and the kitchen gardens in the village had turned into white rectangles, the first green shoots had appeared in Anya's underground greenhouse. Small, thin, pale green, they reached toward the cloudy light filtering through the old glass. Anya looked at them every morning. She watered them carefully, exactly as much as was needed. Not more, not less. She loosened the earth between the rows. She monitored the moisture, opening and closing the ventilation holes. She had become part of this small underground world. Outside, the village lived its own life. The rumors about the girl with the mole burrow had not gone away. On the contrary, they had grown and acquired new details. People said she had gone completely feral, that she lived like an animal, that her parents had thrown her out for good reason. Uncle Semyon, whenever he met neighbors, unfailingly shook his head and repeated that nothing good would come of this scheme. Several times some of the teenagers walked up to the hill and shouted something mocking. Anya heard them, but didn't react. She had no time to react. She was working. In December, real frost struck. Not the ordinary kind that came every autumn, but serious, vicious ones. The thermometer dropped to -25 and stayed there, as though it had decided not to rise again. Pipes froze in some of the houses. Roads were buried under such snowfall that the supply truck couldn't get into the village for 3 days running. The old people said there hadn't been a winter like this in 20 years, if not more. Nothing was left in the kitchen gardens. All the late stores kept in outdoor pits, and poorly insulated cellars had perished. The potatoes had frozen through. The carrots had turned wooden and flavorless. Several families who had counted on their winter stores found their larders empty. Anxiety settled over the village. People began counting their supplies. They looked at weather forecasts and frowned. Conversations at the shop, by the post office, at the well became different, shorter, more serious. Children sensed the tension in the adults and stopped playing outside. And beneath the hill at the edge of the village, in a clay greenhouse with cloudy panes, it was warm. Anya sat inside, her back against the wall, listening to the wind howling outside. She knew what was happening in the village. Rumors reached her even here. She thought about it, and she decided what to do next. Mitya came running to her at the end of December, flushed from the cold, agitated. He scrambled down into the pit and told her that the potatoes were running out at home, that there were queues at the shop and no bread had been delivered for several days. Anya listened. She looked at her beds, green, alive, quietly growing in the half-darkness. Then she asked Mitya to tell his mother to come here the next morning. The following morning, a short woman arrived at the greenhouse in a thick shawl with a tired face. She stopped at the edge of the pit and looked down for a long time. Then she carefully descended the earthen steps and went inside. The warmth hit her face. Warm, moist, living air, while outside it was -25. And greenery. Real greenery. Even rows of spring onion, bushy clumps of parsley, dark lettuce leaves. The woman reached out her hand and touched a green onion leaf gently, as though not quite believing. She looked at it for a long time. Then she raised her eyes to Anya. Anya cut a large bunch of spring onion with scissors and held it out in silence. The woman took it, pressed it to her chest, and suddenly began to cry, quietly, unexpectedly, taken aback by herself. Anya said nothing. She simply waited beside her. The news spread through the village in 2 days. Not loudly, without announcements, simply from person to person, from house to house, the way it happens in small villages. First, 2 more women came, with empty bags and cautious looks. Anya gave each of them what she could. Then a young man from the next street arrived. He said he had 2 children at home and everything was running out. Anya gave him a bunch of radishes and some parsley. She gave away what she had grown. Carefully, knowing the greenhouse wasn't endless, but understanding too that keeping it all to herself was impossible and wrong. The rumors changed. Now at the shop, people were not talking about a crazy girl with a mole pit. They were talking about the greenhouse. They were talking about the warmth there and the growing greens. They spoke quietly, as though not quite yet believing, but they talked all the same. Uncle Semyon heard too. He came one day at the end of December, alone, without any neighbors, in the early morning hours when there was nobody yet at the greenhouse. He stood at the edge of the pit, looked down, and said nothing. For a long time. Then he descended. He walked inside. He looked around, studying the clay walls, the frames with their cloudy glass, the ventilation holes covered with sacking. He examined everything slowly and attentively, like a man seeing something he had previously not understood. Anya stood beside him and waited. For a long time he didn't speak. Then he said one word, "Clever," and added nothing else. He left without asking for anything. But 2 days later he came back, this time with a wheelbarrow in which lay some old boards. Without any explanation, he began reinforcing the earthen steps, the very ones that had been too steep and slippery. Anya watched him for a few seconds. Then she picked up her spade and went to loosen the beds. January brought even greater cold. -27. -30 for several days in a row. Not even the oldest residents of Malinovka could remember anything like it. The sky hung pale and white. The sun barely appeared. The snow crunched underfoot like dry sand. Supplies in the village were dwindling at an alarming rate. The district authorities sent a truck with food, but it didn't go far. What was delivered was clearly less than what was needed. People began reducing their portions. In some families, children ate once a day. Anya's greenhouse ran without stopping. She expanded the planting as far as the space would allow. She added another row of onion along the wall. She sowed new radish seeds. She went without sleep at night, thinking about how to use every centimeter of space more efficiently. Mitya came every day. He helped with watering, weeding, cutting the ready greens. He no longer seemed like the curious boy who had come with a child's spade. He worked seriously, with concentration, like a real assistant. People began coming to the greenhouse in a steady stream. Now they came openly, not furtively, not with apologetic looks. They came in families. They came and asked for a little greenery. Anya refused no one, only asked them to take exactly what was needed, no more. One day the very woman who had chased her from the yard in October came. She stood at the entrance to the greenhouse for a long time, unable to make herself go in. Then she finally entered. She looked at Anya, lowered her gaze, quietly asked for forgiveness. Anya was silent for a moment. Then she cut a bunch of parsley and held it out without a single extra word. No reproaches, no triumph. By February, the greenhouse was feeding almost 200 people. It was no longer just a greenhouse. It had become something like a living center of the village. People came not only for greens. They came for the warmth, when home was cold and dreary. They came to talk, because in this small underground space with its smell of earth and living greenery, everything seemed a little simpler and lighter. Someone began helping without being asked. brought extra frames for the second greenhouse that Anya was planning to start building. Someone hauled in a sack of compost. Someone repaired one of the supporting beams that had begun to crack under the weight of the snow load. The village was teaching itself to work together, and it had all begun with one girl who simply started digging. In February, a journalist from the district newspaper arrived, a young fellow in a large hat, with a camera slung over his shoulder. Someone from the village had written to the editorial office. He descended into the greenhouse, looked around, stared for a long time at the even green beds. Then he took out a notebook and asked Anya a few questions. She answered briefly that she had read a lot, that she knew the principle, that she had simply tried. The article came out a week later. Small, on the fourth page, with one photograph, Anya standing inside the greenhouse, green rows of onion and parsley behind her, cloudy window frames above her head. The headline was simple: 16-year-old girl builds underground greenhouse and feeds village through the frosts. People read it, first in the district. Then it was reprinted in the regional paper. Then someone posted the photograph on the internet, and it began to spread, slowly at first, then faster and faster. Anya heard about this from Mitya, who came running, agitated, saying he had seen her photo on some website. She wasn't quite sure what that meant in practice. She was busy. The east wall of the second greenhouse needed reinforcing. She and Uncle Semyon had begun building it together. Yes, with Uncle Semyon, the very one who had been first to call her a mole. Now he came every morning, even before the others appeared. He worked in silence, solidly, the way older men work when they have built things with their hands all their lives. He and Anya barely spoke, but it was a good silence. The silence of two people who understand each other without words. One day, when they were taking a break and warming their hands over a small brazier, he said quietly that he had been wrong, that he should have helped from the very beginning, that he shouldn't have laughed. Anya looked at the fire. She answered that everything was all right. But something inside her, something that had been clenched tight since that October morning when she walked along the roadside with her backpack on her shoulders, loosened a little in that moment. Spring arrived in the middle of March. The snow began to melt. The gray sky grew lighter. Birds returned earlier than usual, or perhaps it only seemed that way after the long winter. Something had changed in the village, not immediately visible, but real. People greeted each other more readily. Neighbors stopped more often to talk. Several families who had barely spoken before began planning their spring gardens together and asking Anya to advise them on how to prepare the soil properly. She advised them. She explained. She showed them drawings from her notebook. The notebook that Nina Petrovna had once given her was now worn and written through to the last page. Anya bought a new one, with the small amount of money that the village residents had collected for her as a group, and brought one day without warning, a little embarrassed, as though they weren't sure quite how to do it properly. She took the money. She thanked them, and she knew immediately what she would spend it on. By April, the second greenhouse was ready. Larger than the first, better insulated, with more carefully thought-out ventilation and additional shelving along the walls for seedlings. Uncle Semyon made a wooden door, a proper one, on hinges, with a handle. It turned out solid and well-made. Several families came and worked together, some weeding, some watering, some reinforcing the walls. It was no longer only Anya's greenhouse. It had become something shared. Nina Petrovna, the very biology teacher who had once given Anya her notebook, learned about everything from the article in the regional paper. She came to Malinovka in April on the local bus, an elderly woman with a heavy bag and thick-lensed glasses. She descended into the greenhouse. She stood there for a long time, looking at everything around her. Then she found Anya and simply embraced her. Without a word, Anya stood in that embrace and was slow to realize that her cheeks were wet. She hadn't cried in a long time, not since October. In spring, people came to Malinovka from neighboring villages. Some had heard, some had read about it, some simply wanted to see for themselves. They walked through the greenhouses, asked questions, took notes. One man came from a village 40 kilometers away and explained that they had the same problem: poor winter stocks, freezing storage. He asked whether it was possible to try replicating it. Anya handed him a new notebook into which she had copied all the diagrams and instructions, the entire process from start to finish. He took it. He went home. By summer, Anya knew that similar greenhouses had begun to be built in several neighboring villages. She thought about this sometimes, about how strange it was and how right at the same time. What had begun with one hole in the earth, dug with frozen hands, with no money and no one's help, had turned into something spreading further and further, like ripples on water. In summer, a representative of the district administration came to Malinovka, official, in a good jacket, with a folder of documents. He talked about support, about grants, about including the experience in the district agricultural development program. Anya listened to him patiently and thought about how strangely life was arranged. Less than a year ago, she had slept under tarpaulin and didn't know whether there would be food tomorrow. And now an official in a jacket sat before her and spoke about programs. In autumn, Anya went to study. The district agricultural college, not too far away, reachable by bus. Several people in the village had arranged for her to go on living in Malinovka and continuing to look after the greenhouses, while they would help. There were now people there to help. Uncle Semyon took on the daily rounds. Mitya, now almost 11 years old, serious and responsible beyond his years, kept watch over the watering. Anya left for school with the same backpack, the old one she had come with a year ago. But now it held textbooks and new notebooks rather than a handful of seeds and a coil of wire. Although she had taken seeds too. A few packets, just in case. Old habits don't leave easily. At the bus stop, half the village came to see her off. Mitya waved. Uncle Semyon coughed and pointedly looked away, but his eyes were bright. Mitya's mother said she would be waiting for her at the weekend. Nina Petrovna stood a little to one side and smiled. The bus moved off. Anya looked out of the window until the village had disappeared around the bend. Then she took out her new notebook and began to write. Ahead of her was a great deal of work. There was still much to learn, to try, to build. She had more ideas than pages in the notebook. But one thing Anya knew for certain. The earth is warm. Even in the hardest frosts, at sufficient depth, it remains warm. You simply must not be afraid to dig.